So good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here tonight to introduce this lecture and our distinguished speaker. My name is Raimundo Barreto, and I am an associate professor of world Christianity at Princeton Theological Seminary, serving in the history and ecumenics department, and currently the chair of the department. So the Frederick Neumann Memorial Lecture was established in 1984 in honor of Dr. Frederick Neumann, a Christian evangelist, missionary, pastor, and professor. And since that year, 1984, a number of distinguished speakers have come to annually lecture on different themes of special biblical, historical, and theological significance. Frederick Neumann was born into a middle-class Jewish family in Vienna, Austria, in the year 1899. He studied philosophy under such luminaries as Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger. In 1922, he was awarded his doctorate with a dissertation on Hermann Lotze. Dr. Neumann's coming to faith began a chain of events, which included his meeting with Edith Spitzer, herself a Jewish Christian, and their marriage in 1927. Then followed the Christian missionary service among the Jews in Austria, Yugoslavia, and Palestine. Ordained to preach congregational ministry, he and his wife came to the United States after the Second World War. Dr. Neumann accepted the call of the Bushwick Avenue Congregational Church in Brooklyn, where he served with faithfulness and distinction until his death in 1967. So we have the honor today of welcoming Dr. Christopher Tounsel, who will deliver this distinguished lecture. Dr. Tounsel is a historian of modern Sudan who explores the function of race and religion as political technologies. He serves as the Walker Family Endowed Professor in History, Associate Professor of History, and Director of African Studies Program at the University of Washington. His first book, Chosen Peoples, Christianity and Political Imagination in South Sudan, was a finalist for multiple book prizes and explored how Southern Sudanese intellectuals used Judeo-Christian scriptures to frame revolutionary struggle. His most recent book, Bounds of Blackness, African Americans, Sudan, and the Politics of Solidarity, received honorable mention for the International Studies Association's Book Award and explores African American engagement with Sudan from the late 19th century to the Obama era. Dr. Tounsel's scholarship stands beyond academia through expert commentary that he has provided on Sudan and South Sudan for outlets such as the BBC, Al Jazeera, PBS, and NPR. A native from Chicago, Dr. Tounsel lives in Metro Seattle with his wife Timeka and his son Cairo. He enjoys reading, watching women's basketball, and cheering on his beloved Chicago Bears. The topic of his lecture is Rendering to Caesar, Lessons from Wartime Sudan. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Christopher Tounsel.
Thank you so much, Raimundo, for that very gracious introduction. And before I begin, I just want to thank Dean John Bolin, President Jonathan Lee Walton, the Faculty of History and Ecumenics, Maggie Osborne, Christina Esteritu, and everyone who played a part in bringing me to Princeton this evening. I am truly honored to be speaking before you today. On April 15th, 2023, civil war broke out in Sudan. between the paramilitary rapid support forces and the Sudanese armed forces. That day, in the sun-baked capital of Khartoum, RSF fighters seized the All Saints Anglican Cathedral and transformed the House of God into an operations base. The Most Reverend Ezekiel Kondo was in the cathedral at that time. And 9 years earlier, Kondo had been appointed Archbishop of the province of Sudan and Bishop of Khartoum at All Saints. And he had witnessed several changes in the country since his appointment. Longtime President Omar al-Bashir had been ousted. Christmas had been declared a public holiday in the overwhelmingly Muslim country. Today it's about 90% Muslim. And Christian schools could begin operating on Saturday. But that fateful April day, as Reverend Kondo was in his office preparing for Sunday service, all hell broke loose. We heard a very heavy sound of gunfire, he shared, only to get out and find heavy smoke billowing nearby. 119 years earlier, in February of 1904, a ceremony was held to commemorate the laying of the cathedral's foundation stone. There, a Welsh footballer turned clergyman named Llewellyn Gwyn raised his voice to the heavens and beseeched God to bless the work symbolized by the new building. And he prayed, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of the living God, who art the brightness of the Father's glory and the express image of his person, the chief cornerstone hewn from the mountain without hands. Bless this stone which we lay in thy name, and be, we beseech thee, the beginning, the increase, and the consummation of this our work, which is undertaken to the glory of thy name, who with the Father and the Holy Ghost liveth and reigneth, ever one God, world without end. Amen. Separated by 12 decades of history, that 1904 prayer and the 2023 barrage could not appear to be more disconnected. However, if we consider the evangelical dimensions that fueled British colonialism in Sudan and the post-colonial state's attempts to form the country in Islam's image, no phenomenon stitches Sudanese history together more than the state's political uses of religion and the church's response. The religious elements and legal ramifications of the ongoing conflict between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces shows that this moment is no different. And the country's history of church-state relations has lessons to consider for Sudan's uncertain present and future. So I am an historian by training, and so I do have to give a little bit of historical background. So from 1899 until 1956, England and Egypt governed Sudan as a de facto colony known as the Anglo-Egyptian Condominium. And though Britons used missionary work to provide moral justification for their imperialist expansions, they took a more tempered approach to Sudan, which Herbert Kitchener's Anglo-Egyptian army had, quote unquote, reconquered from the Islamic Mahdiya. As a matter of state security, the new colonial government prohibited any mission operating north of the 10th parallel or any other area that it recognized as already being predominantly Islamic. Though Bishop Gwynn was allowed to minister to British soldiers and civilians in Khartoum, Kitchener banned his right to missionize in northern Sudan, which, for the purposes of kind of common geographic explanation, northern Sudan actually covers about the top 3/4 of the map of Sudan that you see here. But southern Sudan, which was inaccurately deemed a type of religious tabula rasa, was deemed suitable for missionary labor. And in time, a state-sponsored bifurcation emerged as the British aimed to separate the predominantly Islamic and Arabic-speaking North from the multi-ethnic and missionized South. While the government ruled from the northern capital of Khartoum, Presbyterians, Anglicans, and Catholics converged in southern Sudan to build mission schools, translate indigenous languages, and evangelize southern Sudanese ethnicities. And on January 1st, 1956, a divided Sudan became an independent nation. Some of you may have been taught that Ghana was the first sub-Saharan African nation to become independent of Britain following World War II. I always make it a point to say that that is incorrect. Sudan was actually the first. The reasons for that, I explain in my book, but it does deal with kind of global conceptions of Blackness and the connections to transatlantic slavery. So Sudan becomes independent in January of 1956. And the newly independent government soon marshaled the law in its attempt to concretize a new religious vision for the country. Now, South Sudanese were not enthused with their historical marginalization in national politics and in the process that had led to Sudanese independence. And anxieties towards Sudanese Arabs that were rooted in historical enslavement of Blacks in South Sudan, as well as contemporary fears that new oppressions would arise, brought tensions to a boiling point. The civil war erupted between northern and southern Sudan in August 1955 and lasted 17 years until 1972. During that conflict, the Khartoum-based government tried to forge Sudan as an Islamic country through a variety of measures, which I will get into momentarily. So how then did Sudanese Christians approach a government that was opposed to their interests? Despite acknowledging that Christians are called to render to Caesar, calculated references to scripture, the history of the early church, and understandings of the roles of church and state revealed a defiance to the government's aims. And within the calculus of the First Sudanese Civil War, it was evident that rendering to Caesar was believed to have its limits. In February of 1956, Catholic ordinaries in Sudan published a letter outlining the purposes and roles of church and state. They explained that men may have chosen rulers, but God gave rulers their authority. And God, furthermore, willed the state and designed it to promote the common good. To justify their claim, the ordinaries refer to Matthew chapter 22, which records an episode in which the Pharisees send some of their followers to trap Christ in his words. They approach Jesus and, after first acknowledging his spirit-filled teaching, ask for his opinion on the righteousness of paying the imperial tax to Caesar. Now, of course, Christ, being Christ, can see their hypocrisy from a mile away, and after calling them out on it, asks to see the coin used for paying the tax. They bring him a denarius, and he asks whose image and inscription were emblazoned on the silver coin. Christ proceeds to command his questioners to render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Based on this teaching, the Sudanese ordinaries implored that church and state were distinct spheres, and that cooperation was imperative because they shared authority over the same people. But the Sudanese government had a different approach. And education became a space where mission and state came into conflict. The government's formal initiative against missionary schools began in February of 1957, when Minister of Education Ziada Arbab informed the vicars apostolics and prefects apostolics representing Southern Sudan that the government intended to take over Southern education. Missionaries wanted Christians to still be able to receive Christian schooling, but when the government took over Nuba Mountain schools, those who practiced neither Christianity nor Islam were instructed in Islam unless their parents objected. Arabic was mandated throughout all the schools and was ordered to be taught through the Quran, right? So the idea of the Quran being used not only as a source of religious instruction, but linguistic instruction as well. Now, while Protestant missions accepted the government's takeover of mission schools, the Roman Catholics refused to hand the schools over without Vatican approval. And the Sudanese Catholic newspaper, The Messenger, which started publishing in the 1930s and ran all the way through the 1960s, made a bold claim, quote, "In these days, when the state is endeavoring to claim complete control of education, we wish to make it clear that no Catholic can ever admit such a claim. The church has been given a special mandate and right by Christ to share in teaching mankind. Parents have the right as well as the duty to educate the children given them by God. These rights of the church and the parents must, therefore, be respected by the state," end quote. And so Catholic representatives in time would issue demands and proposals that included basically the fact that headmasters of transferred Catholic schools should remain Catholic, and that Catholicism should be the only religion taught in the schools taken over by the state. And the Catholic Messenger newspaper, as you could imagine, quickly came into the crosshairs of the state and was basically pressured into closing by the early 1960s. In 1960 marked a major moment in state-sponsored Islamization, as the government not only ordered more mosques and Quranic schools to be opened in Southern Sudan, but also replaced a Sunday with Friday, obviously the weekly Muslim holiday, as the South's new weekly holiday. The Friday law generated fierce reactions throughout the South, but particularly in schools, where Catholic priests like Paulino Logale led a student protest. While some protested the Friday law, some missionaries were intimidated by the government and ordered their students to repent for politicizing the matter. A man named Max Warren, who was the Africa Secretary of the Church Missionary Society, put forth a compelling historical argument. He responded to the protest by referencing similar circumstances that the early church faced under Rome, noting that in the pre-Constantinian church, Christians were not allowed to celebrate Christ's resurrection on the first day of the week and had to participate in common life despite their conviction. The expectation was that wherever they could, they should meet to break bread together. In addition, he added that Caesar, in this case, was not comparable to Nero, who obviously used the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD as an excuse to persecute Christians, or Diocletian, who ordered churches to be razed to the ground, scriptures burnt, and church leaders imprisoned. Right? So the idea being that he did not kind of put Ibrahim Aboud in the same class as Nero and Diocletian. More than this, he shared that Christians in the early church witnessed so well that even Caesar himself eventually converted. Aside from the government's temporary decision to abolish Sunday as a day of rest, Christian clerics and lay people faced more obstacles from the state. The government restricted freedom of movement for Sudanese priests, outlawed prayer gatherings outside churches, and arrested protesting priests. Arguing that Islam was being imposed upon them, some Christians declared that no person, be they king or emperor, could make them go contrary to God's commandments and their own conscience. A Missionary Societies Act promulgated in 1962 aimed to allow unrestrained government interference with missionaries. It ordered indigenous pastors to be registered and licensed by the state, and stipulated that registered church workers be paid by the ministry. In the wake of the 1962 Missionary Societies Act, and believing that church communication now required secrecy, Anglican Bishop Oliver Allison and former CMS General Secretary Max Warren assigned biblical names for certain figures and organizations in Sudan because, as Warren stated, we ought to be able to find appropriate biblical parallels to meet the situations. This code appears in Warren's July 9th, 1962 letter to Allison. Now, I don't know how many graduate students are in here, but I remember the day that I was in the archive in Durham, England, and when I stumbled upon this document, I mean, the document to me, its countenance was as lightning and its raiment was as white as snow. I was like, I cannot believe that I found this, that this exists, like this is golden, right? So understanding that I'm giving this presentation at a seminary, some of you probably know more in your pinky about the names and figures on the right than I do. And so, but I will just provide brief summaries of certain terms, okay? A few of them certainly stand out to me, right? So the code name for the Sudanese church, or church in the land of unbelievers, is an ecumenical one, right? Making no distinction between Catholics and Protestants. And the code elsewhere includes the head of the Anglican Communion, right? The Archbishop of Canterbury, Roman Catholics, American Presbyterians, which to this day, the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia is a treasure trove of documents related to Sudanese Presbyterian history, and the Church Missionary Society. The Rechabites, who I will admit I did not know about this group before stumbling on this document, but the Rechabites, whom the American Presbyterians were likened to, were an Old Testament group that escaped King Nebuchadnezzar's invasion and entered Jerusalem. The use of Rabshakeh to discover the governor of Juba, a man named Ali Baldo, and I've actually had a chance to meet Ali Baldo's son, is also noteworthy. Rabshakeh appears in 2 Kings chapter 18 as a Babylonian emissary sent to Israel to negotiate the terms of its submission. In his attempt to scare the Israelite officials, Rabshakeh praised Babylonians' might while questioning the power of Israel's God. And he implored his audience not to trust in the venerable King Hezekiah. Rabshakeh represents blasphemous power that disregards God and mocks God's people. A very notorious figure with which to liken the governor of Juba, Juba being one of the administrative capitals of South Sudan. Whether Khartoum represented Babylon or Rome, the inference that the Sudanese church was facing a state that was opposed to its interests is clear. And comparing Khartoum to those historical precedents suggests an understanding that Christians in the country were facing a timeless attack on their faith. Following the expulsion of 300 foreign missionaries in 1964, the Catholic Verona Fathers published a response to the government entitled The Black Book of the Sudan. And in it, they acknowledged the Catholic Church's belief that the state is an institution of divine origin, and that while the church acknowledged and supported the state's indisputable rights, it could not allow the church's distinctive character to be sacrificed to the whims of men who often identified their ideas of the state as being God-ordained. The war dragged on until hostilities came to an end with the 1972 Addis Ababa Agreement. And while that peace agreement did give Southern Sudanese greater autonomy within a national framework, its troubles and those of the church were far from over. Following the passage of the Addis Ababa Agreement, the Sudanese Muslim Brothers opposed the peace, doing so on the grounds that it would stand against an Islamic constitution. And different religious factions viewed the agreement as a violation of Islam's supremacy in Sudanese life. Following a failed 1976 coup, President Jafar Numeri addressed the opposition by adopting an Islamic political agenda. The Second Sudanese Civil War ignited in 1983, following President Numeri's decision to replace the civil penal code with Sharia law. Numeri's September laws imposed mandatory hand and feet amputations for certain crimes, as well as banning alcohol. And on the banning alcohol tip, this included churches being charged with a crime even if they contained wine for communion. The Southern Sudanese troops staged a mutiny at Bor in May 1983. And ex-Colonel John Garang, who is the man pictured with his hands up, Incidentally enough, Dr. John Garang, who got a degree from Iowa State University, became a type of George Washington figure in South Sudan, right? He led the rebel Sudan People's Liberation Movement. President Numeri declared that some Islamic laws would apply even to non-Muslims. Multiple persons were amputated for the crime of theft. And in June 1985, Islamic reformer Muhammad Taha was executed with 4 others for opposing Islamization. Despite Numeri's ouster later that year, in 1985, and Prime Minister Sadiq al-Mahdi's announcement that Sharia would be applied in a way that protected non-Muslims' rights, state uses of religion took a sordid turn following Omar al-Bashir's 1989 coup. And I only know that it was June 30th, 1989, because that was my birthday. In addition to dissolving parliament, banning political parties, and restricting freedom of the press, al-Bashir allied with National Islamic Front leader Hassan al-Turabi. The government imposed a vision of Islamic law that restricted women's rights and continued to levy amputations and stoning as punishments. Now, despite the government's aim to rule Sudan as an Islamic state, by the early 1980s, there were in fact 1.1 million Christians in Sudan, which at the time amounted to roughly 7 to 8% of the population. And during the Second Sudanese Civil War, the Sudan Catholic Bishops' Conference, which today exists as the umbrella body of bishops in both Sudan and South Sudan, produced a series of letters that made demands of both Christians and the government. The SCBC's pastoral letter entitled "Lord, Come to Our Aid" was published in June 1984. And in it, the bishops objected to the imposition of Sharia on all citizens, regardless of their religion and culture. Writing, quote, "We were whipped for eating during Ramadan. Others are whipped, fined, and imprisoned because alcohol was found in their houses. Christians are called to take the oath of allegiance to the Quran, thus exposing them to the accusation of disloyalty if they refuse to do so," end quote. Their strongest directive concerning the right Christian response to the implementation of Islamic law was their assertion that when Sharia conflicted with Christian customs and violated freedom of conscience, Christ was the only choice. They reminded readers that standing in Christ's love did not mean bowing to oppression, and that one's right to be a Christian was in fact a human right. Quote, "Using Christ's weapons of love, forgiveness, patience, and understanding does not imply that you give in to injustice. You have to stand for the truth at all times. You are citizens of this country like everyone else, with equal rights to be respected," end quote. The SCBC also produced an appeal entitled "Blessed Are the Peacemakers." After noting their awareness of certain groups ambushing, robbing, killing, and kidnapping, the bishops declared that authorities had a duty before God, from whom their power derived. They highlighted the issue of religious freedom as a litmus test of Sudan's civilized or uncivilized status, by arguing that Sudan would elevate its global reputation if every citizen was free to practice and profess their faith. One of the most fascinating elements of the SCBC pastoral letters was their use of the Bible to frame their positions, right? Addressed to the nation's Christian citizens, one letter began with a reference to Psalm 124, verse 8, quote, "Our help comes from the Lord, who made the heavens and earth." The bishops later wrote that those who should be called to suffer for Christ were obliged to use his methods of reacting to suffering, right? And so in this way, they make this very kind of calculated argument that the more Christian citizens suffered, that would actually prove their citizenship before God, right? Yeah, a very interesting reading that on one hand kind of glorifies suffering, but on the other hand, one might say leaves little room to kind of oppose the state at the time, right? The Second Sudanese Civil War would not end until the Comprehensive Peace Agreement of January 9th, 2005. The CPA gave South Sudanese the option of deciding whether to remain as a single country or to secede in a referendum. And in January 2011, South Sudanese voters decided at a 98.9% clip to secede and to create the world's newest country, the Republic of South Sudan. I had a chance to be in South Sudan on the first anniversary of independence, and I will tell you, I have never seen partying like that. I did not know 30 people could fit in the back of a pickup truck. It can be done because I've seen it in Juba during the independence celebration, okay? So 3 months after South Sudan's secession, then President Omar al-Bashir, the man on the left, declared that Sudan would adopt an Islamic constitution, further evincing religion's dominating influence on his domestic policy agenda. Attacks on Christians worsened thereafter. Before long, however, the writing was on the wall for al-Bashir's iron-fisted but ever-aging regime. South Sudan had pocketed 3/4 of the nation's oil revenues when it had seceded, injuring Sudan's economy. Hundreds protested the government's hike of bread prices amid high inflation in late 2018. And on April 11th, 2019, a military coup forced Bashir from power. Bashir's 30-year rule represented both a long chapter in the state's use of religion to create a social order and a painful era for Sudanese Christians, replete with intimidation, prosecutions, and destroyed houses of worship. And yet, really important questions remained following Bashir's ouster. Would regime change usher in the dawn of a legal framework that actually enforced freedom of religion? And what role would Christians have in the fabric and future of a post-Bashir Sudan? The years following Bashir's ouster in 2019 proved duplicitous, entailing both cosmic changes on the political landscape, but alarming consistency of Christian discrimination. On one hand, the new transitional government, which wanted to present itself as reformist, pledged to improve the country's human rights record. Although Minister of Religious Affairs Nasir al-Din Mufre issued a statement reaffirming the government's pledge to protect freedom of religion, realities on the ground showed a stark difference between official pronouncements and Christians' lived experiences. In Blue Nile State, which borders the country of Ethiopia to the east, 3 churches were each burned down twice over a 3-week period in late 2019 and early 2020. Multiple churches belonging to the Sudanese Church of Christ were targeted by arson, and the image on the right is from the Sudan Church of Christ in Doka town, which was burned down in December of 2022. And Christians selling alcohol reported being subject to punishment. In addition to such acts of physical violence were those harms wrought by legal means. The Miscellaneous Amendments Act of 2020, ratified by the civilian-led transitional government, did not repeal an article of law criminalizing blasphemy, right? And in Jazira State, which is kind of in the south central region of the country, authorities used the Islamic prohibition banning a Muslim woman from marrying a Christian man to charge a married couple with adultery. Such examples highlighted some of the obstacles that Christian citizens still had to navigate despite Bashir's removal from power. In April 2023, another coup threw another wrench into Christians' future status in Sudan. With Sudanese Armed Forces leader General Burhan and Rapid Support Forces leader Hameti at loggerheads, tensions exploded in April 2023 when SAF and RSF forces fired upon each other in Khartoum. Now 2.5 years into this conflict, more than 14 million people have been displaced. More than 30 million require humanitarian aid, and as many as 150,000 have lost their lives, including very tragically the events that came out of Al-Fashir a couple of Tuesdays ago, where satellite imagery showed, right, blotches of sand bathed in blood. The idea being that once the RSF took over the town, they literally took bodies out of the hospital, killed them, and left them to bleed out in the street. The Rapid Support Forces takeover of Khartoum's All Saints Church, which I began this lecture with, portended future suffering that Christian communities experienced in the months to come. The RSF has targeted Christians through looting, expelling clergy, and desecrating graves. And in the area of cultural heritage, the Rapid Support Forces has also destroyed the National Museum of Khartoum, which houses medieval Christian frescoes, which basically provide kind of public space to show Sudan's kind of multi-religious history, right? In May 2023, the RSF stormed Omdurman's Mary Girgis Church during a Sunday service. Attacking laity and clergy, the RSF looted valuables and destroyed the century-old institution. The paramilitary force has assaulted at least 2 other churches in the country's riverain core, including Khartoum North's Orthodox Coptic Church and Khartoum's Dar Mariam Catholic Church, which is the image that you can see on the left here. In a cruel twist of irony, church structures have become collateral damage as Sudanese armed forces engage the RSF, right? With the evidence showing that the SAF bombards churches not because they are ideologically anti-Christian, but because the churches are where the RSF troops are, right? So basically churches being attacked because they are bases of operations, but attacked and destroyed nonetheless, right? That being said, Sudanese human rights lawyer Mohamed El Noor has pointed out that the Orthodox patriarchy building that was basically looted in an SAF-controlled neighborhood in Umdurman undermines the idea that the SAF has only damaged churches in pursuit of the RSF. The civil war has entered a puzzling point where both sides appear to have cause to rejoice. While the Sudanese armed forces has wrested control of the national capital of Khartoum, the RSF has cemented its control of Darfur and signed a charter with allies that sets the stage for establishing a parallel government, paving the way for partition. So it is now a very realistic outcome that basically the areas that you see in green partition and secede from Sudan to basically create a third Sudanese country, right? South Sudan to the south, RSF country to the west, and Sudan in pink to the east. The SAF, however, has retaken territory in the nation's ever-important geographic center. And as we can see here, the SAF controls the Red Sea coast, which is obviously very important for maintaining an economic foothold in the region. As uncertain as the future may be, any scenario resulting in practical freedom of religion and legal protections against discrimination must involve the opening of humanitarian pathways for aid and free and fair elections resulting in civilian governance. In constructing a post-war jurisprudence that acknowledges the overwhelming Muslim majority while respecting non-Muslims as equal citizens, lawmakers may look to countries like Indonesia or Jordan as comparative frames of reference for contexts where Christians have enjoyed more freedoms than their Sudanese counterparts. So in closing, I believe that this history has much to teach us about the past, present, and future of political theology and church-state relations in Sudan and beyond. And there are many, many, many lessons to draw from, but like Charles Spurgeon, who always preached with 3 main points, I decided to just give 3 main points here, but during the Q&A, happy to discuss more. Right? So despite numerous attempts by church authorities to force the government to treat Christians as full and equal citizens under the law, these efforts have been unsuccessful because the state, like Pharaoh of old, has operated with a hardened heart. As former Dean of St. Paul's, William Inge, once noted, quote, "It takes in reality only one to make a quarrel. It is useless for the sheep to pass resolutions in favor of vegetarianism while the wolf remains of a different opinion," end quote. I am not suggesting that Sudanese Muslims are wolves, right? Quite the opposite. And on the contrary, after Bashir was overthrown, the civilian coalition really prioritized freedom of religion as being one of the bedrocks that was necessary for the new political order in the country. Right? Sudanese Muslim civilians have always been very supportive of their Christian counterparts. However, the autocratic military regimes that have controlled the country since 1956 have had other ideas. Despite protests, despite the 1960s Black Book, despite the SCBC pastoral letters, despite a visit from Pope John Paul II in 1993, and various entreaties from clergy and lay people to obey the state in the hopes that better days would come, Sudan still ranks as the 5th worst country for Christian persecution, according to the Open Doors World Watch List. The lesson here is that reasoned argumentation from church to state may only be as effective as the wisdom of the state in question. And yet, the history of political theology in wartime Sudan teaches another lesson: that in the midst of social, religious, and political persecution, South Sudanese freedom fighters still found the Bible to be a useful spiritual resource in their wars against Khartoum. Right? That while church institutions were trying to talk to the state and convince the state to basically behave, South Sudanese Christians talking to each other were using the Bible to galvanize their attempts to overthrow and remove the state, right? So kind of competing theologies at play, right? In my book, Chosen Peoples, I show how Sudanese rebels created a unified theory of divine chosenness and victory over an evil enemy. In organizing a spiritual, liberatory account of the war, these intellectuals framed events in biblical language, placed their circumstances into a familiar narrative trajectory, and transformed political history into a spiritual chronicle by reframing events into biblical templates. Southern Sudan in this paradigm was Joseph thrown into slavery, the Israelites under Egypt's yoke, the Hebrew exiles in Babylon, and so forth. They framed Khartoum as biblical kakistocracy. Egypt, Babylon, Rome, and even in the 1990s as Satan himself. Far from relying on formal church institutions to reconcile biblical principles of responsible statecraft to fit their wartime situation, lay people deployed their own interpretive energies in ways that served to provide a spiritual boost to their secular fight. And while my talk today has focused on the views and actions of ordained clergy in the history of church-state relations, we cannot neglect the ways that Sudanese lay people have defined the state for themselves and acted accordingly. The final lesson I'd like to highlight is connected to my previous point about the proliferation of competing theologies during Sudan's post-colonial wars. And that is the inspiring, if not miraculous, resilience and growth of the country's Christian community. Even after South Sudan's 2011 secession, which no doubt put a major dent in the proportion of remaining Christians in Sudan, Christians continue to constitute the nation's second largest religious demographic. Its 2 million Christians represent a heterogeneous lot that includes Catholics, Coptic Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Ethiopian Orthodox, Eritrean Orthodox, Presbyterian, Pentecostal, Church of Christ, Episcopal, and even Jehovah's Witnesses. Right? And while words like stubborn, persistent, and unyielding best characterize Khartoum's approach to the church, these words can also be applied to those who, like the Corinthians of old, have been troubled on every side, yet not distressed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, cast down, but not destroyed. 121 years after the laying of the All Saints cornerstone, as the hoofbeats of war, famine, pestilence, and death reverberate throughout their country, Sudanese Christians look up to the Lord Jesus Christ, who is the brightness of the Father's glory and the express image of his person, the chief cornerstone hewn from the mountain without hands. To hear their prayer and to be, they beseech him, the beginning, the increase, and consummation of their work, which is undertaken to the glory of his name, who with the Father and the Holy Ghost liveth and reigneth, ever one God, world without end. Amen. That's all I've got. Okay.
Thank you so much. This is a very rich, informative, enlightening, thoughtful lecture. And it sheds light to a context that I think many of us are not familiar with, don't hear about, either in the news. We are very little, in sometimes very distorted information through the news, but also in the scholarly world. So I'm very grateful to you and
Thank you so much.
Very helpful, informative lecture. Now we have some minutes to react, ask questions, engage with Dr. Tounsel. So anyone who wants to get us started? Yes.
Yeah, I guess I was
Okay.
just...
Identify yourself and then...
Oh, sorry. Amelia Kendi, I'm assistant professor here of medieval history.
Okay.
I'm just wondering, I guess, if you could speak more about all the incredible internal diversity of Christianity within Sudan for the past, however long. Because we saw so many images and examples from different traditions, and I guess I was wondering about, a lot of things, but does all that internal diversity, did it in any ways sort of hamper the effort of the church as a whole to sort of respond as a unified body to the government, or was there just a lot of ecumenical, we need to come together at this moment over the decades to sort of have a unified response? But just, sort of what the ecumenical character looks like in Sudan.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that question. So, despite the fact that Sudan today is basically 90% Muslim, it has a Christian heritage going back at least to the 3rd or 4th century CE, right? This was the church where you had a Christian Nubian kingdom basically exist until the 14th century, 15th century, right? So it is only really in the 15th century that Islam becomes the demographically predominant religion of the country. But because of Sudan's proximity both to the Coptic Church north in Egypt, as well as the Ethiopian Orthodox Church to the east, you do have a very rich tradition there. However, as we get into the 20th century, there's really 3 denominations that begin to have a denominational hegemony, right? Those are the Catholics, the Anglicans, and the Presbyterians. And these are connected to really reasons of colonialism. The Anglicans, of course, because of the English, the Catholics because the Italian Catholic Church was already active in the Horn of Africa, and the Presbyterians, which had been very active in North Africa and had founded institutions like the American University in Cairo, right? So there is a way in which those 3 denominations start to become politically and demographically paramount among Christian bodies. The unfortunate thing, though, in terms of your question about ecumenism in Sudan and the kind of political power of that, is that you have so many different groups of Christians but the Sudanese state since 1956 has created such barriers for a kind of cross-pollination, if you will, of Christian groups to be active and to kind of marshal political power, right? So there's a way in which, because of church-sponsored oppression, a lot of these denominations have basically had to operate underground, right? And today, even in Darfur, you have pockets of Christians, but they literally pray in their houses away from, state surveillance, right? But there are documents at Lambeth Palace in London that kind of show the ecumenical history. And certainly the World Council of Churches was very instrumental in helping to broker the 1972 Addis Ababa Agreement. Sure.
Related, but from another perspective, because you mentioned the different strategies between the leadership of these churches and the lay people. Struggle for freedom. And what's the level of tension between them?
Sure.
And how is that like, if that's something that also gets in the way, or if the leadership at the end of the day is also influenced by the organization of the masses?
Absolutely. That's a great question. In the first Sudanese civil war, you have more unity between certainly Catholic priests and Catholic lay people. The Catholic priests, literally, some of them took up arms, fought, and died in the bush, right? They were the machine gun preachers before Gerard Butler and, that guy, right? So they definitely had an approach to God and an approach to their vocation that said, we are called to defend our sheep, not in word only, but even, on the front, right? What's unfortunate, though, is that in the Second Sudanese Civil War, while groups like the SCBC were trying to reason with Khartoum, right, and really put forward these reasoned, biblically principled pastoral letters, with the SPLA, you have the emergence of a martial theology. And I believe that they assumed this martial theology in order to curry the favor of the evangelical right in the United States, right? This is the era of rampant Islamophobia, right? This is the era of, Sudan housing Osama bin Laden and, basically earning a place on the state sponsor of terrorism list with the State Department. Sudan becomes increasingly a pariah state following the bombing of the World Trade Center in 1993, and then obviously with 9/11. The SPLA knows this. And so the SPLA tries to present to the world, we are these suffering Black persecuted people, right? We are facing an Arab Islamic oppressor, right? And the more they really leaned into this us against them, good versus evil, the more we see editorials in the SPLA's propaganda newspaper, saying we are engaged in literal spiritual warfare, right? We are fighting the Antichrist in the persons of Omar al-Bashir and Hassan Tarabi, right? I've written on this propaganda newspaper because it is salacious. Like it is really salacious stuff, right? But really rich, if not always accurate, theology, right? So that's just to say that certainly, the SCBC, I think, takes an approach of, we can't do this, right? We still have a relationship with the Holy See, and we think that the best way to present ourselves as a church is to take the high road, just being real. The lay people, right? The people writing in, the SPLA, people who I've spoken with, they take a to heck with that. We're going to go down in the theological gutter, if you will, and call Khartoum every name under the sun, Egypt, Babylon, evil, right? So there are definite tensions there, but both very political in their own ways.
That doesn't take people away from the church or...
So that's what's been tough. So certainly since 2011, so since South Sudan seceded, South Sudanese clergy have found themselves within the crosshairs of the new South Sudanese state. Now, why is that? The reason being that the South Sudanese clergy, whose names were published in the SPLA propaganda newspaper, right? Those clergy who presented themselves as the kind of spiritual authorities of the South Sudanese liberation movement, they were speaking truth to power, and power at that time was Khartoum. Well, now the power is Juba, right? Now the power is the new independent South Sudanese government. And so when they continue speaking truth to power, the very South Sudanese government that one might say benefited from the spiritual, clothing, if you will, that these priests gave them, are turning against them. Salva Kiir, who is the president of South Sudan, he's a Catholic, but he has delayed elections numerous times. Priests have been killed. Priests who have been trying to call out Salva Kiir from the pulpit have found themselves arrested. The Catholic radio station in Juba, Radio Bakita, was stormed by secret police, right? So there's a way, a very sad way, in my opinion, in which the same Catholic Church that was seen as being on the side of the oppressed and the persecuted in South Sudan is now being attacked by the very government that emerged from that struggle. So yeah.
Thank you, and I just want to repeat what Professor Barreto said in terms of bringing attention and awareness and this kind of historical depth and richness to the complexity of this, which is just sorely needed. I'm curious about, pulling on the thread that Professor Barreto opened up, I'm curious about your previous slide. If you could go back to your previous slide.
Yes.
In terms of the lessons that you took us through. And again, kind of pulling on some of the insights that you've just shared, right, about, for example, the church's capacity for resilience and growth in wartime. And then looking at that and juxtaposing that against the first lesson.
Yes.
As it relates to the futility of reasoning with hard state, right? I was curious about those definitions in your word choices.
Sure, yes.
So like what you mean by futility, reasoning, hard state, like, you know, how those terms themselves are working, because then that for me might inform like how I think about the church's capacity and what resilience looks like. You know, whether we're talking about liberation, freedom, deliverance. I mean, you know, these are that would inform those kind of, you know. And I know these are probably more theological concepts than you may be thinking about, but but it's so rich that it has me thinking in that direction.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. And I'll admit, when I put the word futility, I felt a little uncomfortable, but I was like, I'm going to go with it because I believe it.
Good. I'm glad
so, so, you know, as someone with a speech impediment, you know, my mom really introduced me to the Exodus narrative of Moses and Pharaoh very early on in my life. And so this term hard-hearted really struck with me as I was preparing this talk and just thinking about the posture of the autocratic regimes that have ruled Sudan. And I use the word hard-hearted because, and again, I'm sure I've got experts in this room, please correct me. But from my study, one of the definitions of the biblical term, often translated as foolish, is the sense of complete resistance to reason, or uncompromising, stubborn, inflexible, right? And I believe that the Sudanese state historically has fit that bill when it comes to its posture towards religious freedom and church-state relations, right? It is not good business in the order of the Westphalian state. It is not good business practice to oppress religious minorities. That doesn't earn you relief from sanctions. That doesn't earn you, profitable trade agreements, right? It is not something that is just smart and wise to do. The regimes have done it repeatedly, right? And so I think that there's a futility of attempting to reason with a hard-hardened state, because I'm very much influenced by the South African theologians during the apartheid era and the Kairos document that folks like Desmond Tutu and other clergy produced in the 1980s, when they said, look, God never called on the Israelites to live side by side with the Egyptians, right? God was focused on deliverance, not coexistence. I'm not calling for an independent, Christian Sudanese state. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is this history might show that trying to persuade and trying to reason with genocidal, murderous military regimes in Sudan may not be worth it because of the example that they have shown. If it's not worth it, then what is the alternative then? I think that's where South Sudanese history shows what a possible alternative is, where if it's not wholesale secession, could it be revolution in a different way, right? Could it be handing power to civilians, right? Going about it a different way, but not trying to, the whole old wine, new wineskins things. Like the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces are the direct descendants of the regimes from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Working with them to forge a better Sudan, I personally don't think is a realistic, right? And so in that sense, I think it is futile, right? It's always useful to speak truth to power, right? Always useful, in my opinion, as a believer, right? To, let the word speak and perform its effectual work. But could it be that Christians are not called to do that in perpetuity with states who have shown themselves that they don't want to listen and to submit to wisdom? So just my thoughts. But, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I'm also appreciated those lessons. And I'm curious also if you have reflected on or thought, like, what sort of lessons are there here for maybe the global church or specifically the Church of the West, as far as like what responsibilities do we have in this situation? Is there a way of being in solidarity with the Christians in Sudan? But then also, how do we do that in a way, as you kind of mentioned, like the West's own complicated history with Islamophobia, neocolonial attitudes, which, I think a lot of times when Christians in the West do bring these sorts of ways up, it's a way of kind of bolstering Islamophobia or bolstering this sorts of attitude of paternalism towards Middle Eastern countries. So I'm kind of curious, do you have any reflections on that as far as how do we be in solidarity?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you so much for that question. And I was actually talking about this with Raimundo over lunch, but in terms of the solidarity piece, I'm reminded of when, Abraham sends off Hagar and Ishmael. Hagar is, depressed, and it's like, dang, like this like really stinks, right? And then, God sends an angel and visits her, and Hagar, calls God the God who sees me, right? To me, I think solidarity today means seeing Sudan, right? Keeping an eye on the country, not allowing the country to be in a footnote, right? Writing to our Congress people, right? Engaging in media that is giving more than a 30-second blurb in a half an hour nightly news program, right? But actually staying informed and being informed, right? Making sure that the Sudanese Christians, Muslims, whoever are seen, right, and heard during this time. In terms of the lesson of the global north, or for the global north, I think that the lesson that comes to my mind is the futility of religious nationalism. And what I mean by that is I think South Sudan shows that in very raw effect, right? As I write about in my book, for years and years, South Sudanese intellectuals viewed and framed themselves as a kind of chosen people, right? And they used the Bible to provide these, very convenient but very powerful scripts for, God is on our side, right? God is a providential God, literally shielding us from rockets, and God is here, right? That's a beautiful thing, right? But I'm reminded of Ridley Scott's Exodus movie, which came out years and years ago. But there's this scene in which, the Hebrews have just crossed the Red Sea. Joshua's sitting down with Moses, and they're kind of like reflecting on, wow, what just happened, Moses surprises Joshua because rather than taking we made it, God is so good, Moses is like, we've got so many different tribes. We've got hundreds of thousands of people. Like, we've been running for so long. What now? Like, we've been focused on freedom for so long. What happens when we actually have it? And I think that South Sudan has shown what Frantz Fanon talked about in the 1950s, right? This idea that nationalism in and of itself is not a political project. Right? Nationally, you can't build infrastructures and institutions that respect religious and racial and ethnic and economic diversity off of just nationalism itself. That takes other stuff, right? South Sudan, since independence, has shown after they crossed the proverbial finish line and reached the promised land, man, have they had a bad experience of independence, right? They had their own 5-year civil war. They had drought, right? Now they're receiving millions of refugees from Sudan. So, right, they still have an undemocratically elected president who has, from pulpits, said he is Joshua, right? Following the example of John Garang's Moses, right? So there's a way in which the limits of religious nationalism are being shown in full effect in South Sudan, in this country, and this would be the subject of a different talk, but I think the limits of religious nationalism are also being shown, right? So I think the lesson here being is that within the context of a persecuted people who believe that they are in a morally legitimate and defensible position, it's great, right? But in and of itself, it's not a successful political project long term, right? And that requires talking across the political aisle, right? That talks working with people who are of your faith group and not, right? So yeah, sure.
There's one more, so we end with this question.
Oh, wow. I'm Carissa. I'm a student here. My background is in refugee resettlement. So when I think about Sudan, I do think about the humanitarian crisis. So you spoke a little bit about the refugee crisis. I was curious, just from like a theological and social perspective, the Christian church in Sudan, South Sudan, how they're responding to that humanitarian crisis as a persecuted population themselves.
Sure, absolutely, thank you. So the South Sudanese churches have been responding by taking on Sudanese refugees. But now the kind of refugee infrastructure within South Sudan is really at a tipping point. Because again, we are talking about, I think the number is 15 million displaced. But of that, Chad and South Sudan have taken the highest number of refugees, right? We know that churches within places like Darfur are still operating, but literally in houses, right? And so in some ways, refugee work is out of the lens of kind of cameras, if that makes sense, right? So it's being done on a very interpersonal sphere. The UN has said repeatedly, look, like the refugee situation is on the precipice of total disaster because, as you, I'm sure well know, aid agencies are not getting the funding that they typically get. The shuttering of USAID has been catastrophic for refugees in Sudan specifically, right? Literally overnight, we know soup kitchens in Khartoum had to close their doors because the USAID funds, right? So I think definitely the resilience is being shown in the church's capacity to be able to, feed, shelter, and clothe those who have fled. But I think the international community of states, just being real, this is a failure of epic proportion when it comes to the people of Sudan being underserved. And yeah, it's just a very, very tragic situation.
Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
The book is so great, but he had a red-eye flight.
Yeah.
It was 6 o'clock, so we are extremely grateful.
Thank you so much.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
Like,
Because the shutdown.